Detective Marcus Rivers' phone buzzed against his hip as he reviewed case files in his downtown office. The caller ID showed his wife's number, but when he answered, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper through tears. "Marcus, I need you to come home. Something happened." 23 minutes. That's how long it took Marcus to break every speed limit between the precinct and their quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook Estates. He'd been a cop for 15 years, and he knew that tone in his wife's voice, the hollow shock that followed trauma. He found Sarah sitting on the front porch steps, her arms wrapped protectively around her 7-month pregnant belly. Her left cheek bore an angry red mark, and her maternity dress was torn at the shoulder. Marcus's hands clenched into fists as he knelt beside her. "Tell me what happened," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the rage building in his chest. Sarah's story came out in fragmented pieces. She'd been watering their small herb garden by the mailbox when Richard Thornton, the HOA president, had approached her with his usual clipboard and scowl. Thornton lived 3 houses down in the largest home on the street, a man who treated the homeowners association like his personal kingdom. He said her garden violated the landscaping guidelines, Sarah whispered, unconsciously touching her cheek. I tried to explain that we'd submitted the proper forms, that we had approval, but he kept getting closer, yelling about property values and neighborhood standards. Marcus listened, his jaw tightening with each word. He'd dealt with Thornton before, brief, tense encounters about mailbox heights and lawn maintenance. The man was a bully who wielded his HOA authority like a weapon, but Marcus had never imagined he'd cross this line. "I asked him to please lower his voice because he was scaring me," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "That's when he grabbed my arm and said I was being disrespectful to community leadership. When I tried to pull away, he shoved me." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His wife, 7 months pregnant with their first child, had been assaulted by their neighbor over a herb garden. "I fell against the mailbox post," Sarah said, her hand moving to her lower back. He just stood there for a moment, like he couldn't believe what he'd done. Then he said this was what happened to people who don't follow the rules, and walked away. Marcus helped Sarah to her feet, his mind already shifting into investigative mode. But this wasn't just another case. This was personal. As they walked toward the house, he noticed curtains twitching in nearby windows. The neighborhood had witnessed everything, yet no one had intervened. "We need to get you checked out at the hospital," Marcus said, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Then we're filing a report." Sarah nodded, leaning into his strength. "Marcus, I'm scared. What if he comes back? What if—" "He won't," Marcus said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. "I promise you, Sarah, he won't." As they drove to the hospital, Marcus thought about Richard Thornton, a man who clearly believed his position in their small community made him untouchable. What Thornton didn't know was that his reign of neighborhood tyranny was about to collide with something much larger than HOA politics. Marcus Rivera wasn't just another resident of Willowbrook Estates. Tomorrow morning, when Thornton arrived at the police station to file what would undoubtedly be a counter-complaint about difficult neighbors, he would discover that the man whose pregnant wife he'd assaulted was Detective Marcus Rivera, his new supervisor's right-hand man, and the officer who would be handling his case. Justice, Marcus reflected grimly, sometimes came with the most unexpected timing. The emergency room doctor assured them that both Sarah and the baby were fine, though she'd have bruising on her arm and back for weeks. Marcus held his wife's hand as they filled out the incident report, his cop instincts warring with his husband's fury. Every detail mattered now: timestamps, witness accounts, photographic evidence of Sarah's injuries. By the time they returned home that evening, Marcus had already made several calls. His partner, Detective Lisa Chen, would handle the initial paperwork to avoid any conflict of interest. The assault would be investigated by the book, no shortcuts, no personal vendettas, just solid police work that would ensure Thornton faced real consequences. Sarah fell asleep early, exhausted from the day's trauma. Marcus sat in his home office staring at Richard Thornton's information on his laptop screen. What he found painted a picture of a man drunk on petty power. Thornton had been HOA president for 6 years, elected unofficially after running unopposed each term. The online neighborhood forum was filled with complaints about his increasingly aggressive enforcement of arbitrary rules. Mrs. Patterson from Elm Street had been fined for having the wrong shade of white on her fence. The Johnsons had received violations for parking their car in their own driveway because it was too close to the property line. But it was the pattern that troubled Marcus most. 3 other incidents in the past 2 years where Thornton had been overly aggressive with residents, all women, all while their husbands were at work. A pushing match with elderly Mrs. Kim over her rose bushes. A shouting confrontation with young mother Jennifer Walsh about her children's toys. None had filed police reports, intimidated by Thornton's threats about making life difficult for problem residents. Marcus's phone rang at 11 p.m. Unknown number. "Detective Rivera?" This is Jennifer Walsh from Maple Drive. I heard about what happened to your wife today. Marcus sat up straighter. Mrs. Walsh. I should have called the police when he did it to me, she said, her voice tight with guilt. Last fall, when my husband was deployed, Thornton came over about Halloween decorations, said they violated community standards. When I disagreed, he grabbed my wrist and twisted it. Told me military wives needed to learn their place in the community. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the pieces of a larger picture clicking into place. Are you willing to make a statement? Yes. And detective, there are others. Mrs. Kim from Pine Street wants to talk too. We've been afraid, but after today, we can't let him keep doing this. After hanging up, Marcus stared out his office window toward Thornton's house. Lights were still on in what appeared to be a home office, probably working on new HOA violations to torment his neighbors with, blissfully unaware of the storm building around him. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the precinct early. He had a meeting with Captain Rodriguez about a new assignment, supervising the community outreach program that handled neighborhood disputes and quality-of-life crimes. It was a promotion he'd been working toward for months, one that would put him in charge of exactly the type of cases that men like Richard Thornton generated. Rivera, glad you're here early, Captain Rodriguez called out as Marcus passed his office. Got someone I want you to meet. Richard Thornton, he's the HOA president from that new suburban development, Willowbrook Estates. He's been asking to speak with someone about escalating problems in his neighborhood. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he looked through the captain's office window. There sat Richard Thornton, in his expensive suit and self-important posture, checking his watch with obvious irritation. He's been waiting 20 minutes, the captain continued. Says he has serious concerns about a resident who's been threatening community safety. Apparently there was some kind of altercation yesterday involving this resident's wife, and now he's worried about retaliation. Marcus stared at Thornton through the glass, watching the man rehearse what was clearly a prepared speech. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had he assaulted a pregnant woman, but he was here trying to frame her husband as the threat. Captain, Marcus said slowly, I'd be very interested in hearing what Mr. Thornton has to say. Perfect. You'll be handling his case going forward anyway, since community disputes fall under your new jurisdiction as of today. Captain Rodriguez clapped Marcus on the shoulder. Think you can manage one overeater neighborhood watch type? Marcus looked at Richard Thornton, who was now standing and straightening his tie, preparing to spin his version of yesterday's events to what he assumed would be a sympathetic ear. I think I can handle Mr. Thornton just fine, Marcus replied, and for the first time since Sarah's phone call yesterday, he almost smiled. Marcus took a moment to compose himself before entering the captain's office. 15 years of police work had taught him the value of controlling his emotions, especially when they threatened to overwhelm his professional judgment. Today, that training would be put to its ultimate test. Mr. Thornton, Captain Rodriguez began, I'd like you to meet Detective Marcus Rivera. He'll be handling your concerns about the situation in your neighborhood. Thornton stood and extended his hand with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to getting his way. Detective Rivera, thank you for making time. I know how busy you must be with real crimes. Marcus shook the offered hand, noting Thornton's firm grip, the same hands that had grabbed and shoved his pregnant wife less than 24 hours ago. Mr. Thornton, please have a seat and tell me about this situation you're concerned about. The captain excused himself, leaving the two men alone. Thornton settled back into his chair, pulling out a leather portfolio with the air of a man about to deliver a well-rehearsed presentation. Detective, I've been president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association for 6 years. In that time, I worked tirelessly to maintain our community's standards and property values. Yesterday, I encountered a situation that I believe represents a serious threat to neighborhood safety. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. Go on. There's a resident, a Detective Marcus Rivera. Actually, perhaps you know him. Thornton paused, clearly expecting recognition. When Marcus remained silent, he continued. This man's wife has been flagrantly violating our landscaping guidelines. When I attempted to address the issue yesterday, she became belligerent and threatening. Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. Threatening in what way? She began shouting at me using profanity, creating a public disturbance. When I tried to calm the situation, she became physical, pushing and shoving. I was forced to defend myself. Thornton's voice carried the practiced sincerity of someone who convinced himself his lies were truth. I'm concerned that if her husband, this Detective Rivera, believes her version of events, he might use his position in law enforcement to retaliate against me. The audacity was staggering. Marcus watched Thornton's performance, noting the man's complete confidence in his fabricated narrative. This wasn't just arrogance, it was the behavior of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. That's quite an accusation, Mr. Thornton, Marcus said quietly. You're suggesting that a fellow police officer might abuse his authority for personal reasons? I'm not making accusations, detective. I'm simply concerned about potential conflicts of interest. Surely you can understand my position. A pregnant woman becomes violent and her husband happens to be armed and empowered by the state. It's a volatile situation. Marcus reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a digital recorder, placing it between them. Mr. Thornton, I'm going to record the remainder of our conversation. For both our protection, you don't mind, do you? Thornton's confidence faltered slightly. Well, I suppose that's standard procedure. It is when we're discussing potential criminal activity. Marcus pressed record. Now let's go through your version of events again. You said Mrs. Rivera became physical with you? That's correct. She pushed me first. And you said you were forced to defend yourself. Can you describe exactly what that defense entailed? For the first time, Thornton looked uncomfortable. I may have had to restrain her to prevent further violence. Restrain her how? I grabbed her arm to stop her from hitting me again. And then? Thornton's story began to unravel under Marcus's methodical questioning. Small inconsistencies became larger contradictions. His description of Sarah as belligerent and threatening didn't match his own admission that she'd been watering plants when he approached her. Mr. Thornton, Marcus said finally, I need to inform you that I am Detective Marcus Rivera. The color drained from Thornton's face. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. The pregnant woman you assaulted yesterday was my wife, Sarah. The Detective Rivera you're so concerned about retaliating against you, that's me. Thornton's hands began to shake. There must be some mistake. I never. Your wife, She what, Mr. Thornton? According to you, she attacked you over a herb garden. But according to her, and according to the hospital records documenting her injuries, you grabbed her arm, called her disrespectful, and shoved a 7 months pregnant woman hard enough to knock her into a mailbox post. This is a setup, Thornton whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. You can't. This isn't legal. You have a conflict of interest. Marcus leaned forward. You're absolutely right. Which is why Detective Chen will be handling your case. She'll want to speak with you about the assault charges being filed against you and about the pattern of similar incidents involving other women in the neighborhood. Pattern? What pattern? Jennifer Walsh, Mrs. Kim. Should I continue? Marcus watched recognition and panic flicker across Thornton's features. They're all willing to testify about your methods of HOA enforcement. Thornton stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. I want a lawyer. I'm not saying another word. That's your right, Marcus said, standing as well. But Mr. Thornton, before you go, I want you to understand something. For 6 years, you've terrorized the residents of our neighborhood because you thought you were untouchable. You targeted women when their husbands weren't around because you believed you could intimidate them into silence. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But you made one critical mistake. You laid hands on my pregnant wife. And now you're going to discover what happens when your petty tyranny collides with actual justice. Thornton backed toward the door, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. This isn't over. You're right, Marcus replied. It's just beginning. Word spread through Willowbrook Estates faster than Marcus had anticipated. By the time he arrived home that evening, Sarah was waiting on the porch with a cup of tea and the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her since the incident. Jennifer Walsh called, she said as he sat beside her. She said Thornton's been arrested. Marcus nodded, pulling his wife close. Detective Chen took him into custody this afternoon. Assault charges for what he did to you, plus 2 additional counts for the incidents with Jennifer and Mrs. Kim. His lawyer managed to get him released on bail, but he's facing real consequences now. What Marcus didn't tell Sarah was how thoroughly Thornton's world had begun to collapse in the hours following their confrontation. After lawyering up at the police station, Thornton had made the mistake of returning to the neighborhood and attempting to rally support from other HOA board members. It had backfired spectacularly. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Dave Martinez. You need to see this. Thornton's having a meltdown at the community center. The community center was only a 10-minute walk from their house. Marcus found a crowd gathered in the parking lot, watching through the windows as Thornton paced frantically inside the meeting room, gesturing wildly at the 3 remaining board members. He's been in there for an hour, Dave whispered, demanding an emergency meeting, talking about conspiracies and police harassment. The other board members look like they want to crawl under the table. Through the window, Marcus could see Thornton pointing at a stack of papers, likely the violation notices he'd been planning to distribute. His face was red with fury, and even from outside, his agitation was palpable. That's when Mrs. Patterson approached Marcus. The elderly woman who'd been fined for her fence color looked nervous but determined. Detective Rivera? I wanted to thank you. What you did today, it's given the rest of us courage. She glanced toward the community center. We've been talking, all of us, about everything Thornton's put us through. The fines, the intimidation, the way he's made this neighborhood feel like a prison. More neighbors gathered around them. The Johnsons, who'd been harassed about their driveway parking. The young couple from Oak Street who'd been fined for having their garbage cans visible from the street. The retired teacher who'd been cited for her garden gnome being inappropriate decoration. "We're calling for a vote of no confidence," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Tomorrow night, emergency HOA meeting. We're removing him from the board entirely." Marcus looked at the crowd of neighbors, people who'd been living in fear of one man's petty tyranny for years. "You don't need my permission for that, but I'll be there to support you." The next evening, the community center was packed. Marcus arrived with Sarah, who'd insisted on attending despite his concerns. Nearly every resident of Willowbrook Estates was present, their faces a mixture of determination and nervous energy. Thornton sat alone in the front table, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. His lawyer sat beside him, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings. The charges against Thornton were now public record, and his arrest had made the local news. The meeting began with Mrs. Patterson reading a formal motion of no confidence. One by one, residents stood to speak about their experiences with Thornton's leadership. The stories painted a picture of systematic harassment and abuse of power. "He fined me $200 for having a wreath on my door in February," said Mrs. Chen from Maple Street. Said it violated the seasonal decoration policy that he created without board approval. "He called code enforcement on my teenage son's basketball hoop," added Mr. Williams. Claimed it was a permanent structure requiring HOA approval. Thornton tried to interrupt several times, but his lawyer wisely kept him quiet. The man who once commanded this room through fear and intimidation was now completely powerless, watching 6 years of neighborhood control crumble around him. When the vote was called, it wasn't even close. 47 residents voted to remove Thornton from the board. 3 abstained, 0 voted in his favor. "This is illegal." Thornton finally exploded, standing so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "You can't do this to me. I've dedicated my life to this community." "Mr. Thornton," Mrs. Patterson said calmly, "your dedication involved assaulting pregnant women and terrorizing your neighbors. I think we've had enough of that kind of leadership." Thornton's face went from red to purple. "You'll regret this. All of you. When property values plummet and this neighborhood turns into a slum, remember that you chose this." He stormed out, his lawyer following apologetically behind him. The room erupted in applause, but Marcus noticed something troubling as he watched Thornton leave. The man's demeanor had shifted from desperate to dangerous. There was a coldness in his eyes that Marcus recognized from his years in law enforcement, the look of someone who'd lost everything and was now focused on revenge. Later that evening, as Marcus and Sarah walked home from the meeting, she squeezed his arm. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked hopefully. Marcus wished he could agree. But something in Thornton's final look, the way he'd stared directly at Marcus before leaving, suggested that while the HOA battle was won, their personal war with Richard Thornton was far from over. "The neighborhood part is over," Marcus said carefully, "but keep the doors locked tonight. And call me if you see him anywhere near the house." Sarah's smile faded. "You think he'll try something?" Marcus thought about the desperate look in Thornton's eyes, the way he fixated on revenge rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. "I think a man who's lost everything he thought made him powerful might do something very stupid." As they reached their house, Marcus noticed a car idling at the end of the street. Too far away to see the driver, but close enough to be watching. The car pulled away as soon as Marcus looked in its direction. Tomorrow, he would increase patrols in the neighborhood. Tonight, he would sleep with his service weapon within reach. Marcus woke to the soft scraping of metal against his back door lock, a sound that 15 years of police work had trained him to recognize instantly. He rolled out of bed silently, grabbing his service weapon from the nightstand. Sarah stirred beside him. "Stay here," he whispered, pressing the panic button on their security system. "Help is coming." Marcus moved through the darkened house with practiced stealth, his heart pounding not with fear, but with cold certainty. He'd been expecting this. Thornton had spent 3 days stewing in his humiliation, his arrest, his complete social destruction. A man like that didn't fade away quietly. The scratching at the door stopped. Marcus heard footsteps moving around the house toward the front. Through the living room window, he saw a shadow testing the windows, looking for an easy entry point. His phone vibrated with a text from the security company. "Police dispatched. ETA 4 minutes." Marcus positioned himself behind the kitchen counter with a clear view of both entrances. The front door handle turned slowly. Thornton had picked the lock. The door opened and Richard Thornton stepped inside, holding a crowbar. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes wild. This wasn't the polished HOA president anymore. This was a man unhinged by the loss of everything he built his identity around. "I know you're awake, Rivera," Thornton called out, his voice echoing in the dark house. "Come out and face me like a man." Marcus kept his weapon trained on the intruder while staying behind cover. "Richard, you need to put down the crowbar and leave. Right now. Put it down." Thornton laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my life, my reputation, my position, my authority, everything I worked for, gone because of you and your lying wife. Your life was destroyed by your own choices. You assaulted a pregnant woman. She disrespected me." Thornton's voice cracked with rage. "They all disrespected me. I gave 6 years of my life to that community, and they threw me away like garbage." Marcus could hear sirens approaching in the distance. He just needed to keep Thornton talking until backup arrived. "The community voted, Richard. They made their choice based on your actions. My actions were for their own good. Someone had to maintain standards. Someone had to keep the riffraff in line." Thornton moved deeper into the house, the crowbar raised. "But you turned them against me. You poisoned them with your lies. I told the truth about what you did to Sarah, to Jennifer Walsh, to Mrs. Kim, about how you terrorized people who couldn't fight back." Thornton stopped, his silhouette visible in the moonlight streaming through the front windows. "Terrorized? I was protecting property values. I was maintaining order. You were a bully who got drunk on power." The sirens were getting closer. Thornton heard them too, and his desperation intensified. "This is your fault," he screamed, raising the crowbar. "All of it. If you hadn't interfered, if you just minded your own business. You made it my business when you put your hands on my wife." Thornton charged toward the kitchen, the crowbar raised above his head. Marcus stepped out from behind the counter, his weapon drawn and aimed. "Drop it, Richard. Drop it right now." But Thornton was beyond reason. He swung the crowbar downward with all his strength. Marcus sidestepped the blow and tackled Thornton to the ground, wrestling the weapon away from him. Years of police training overcame 3 days of rage and desperation. The front door burst open as 4 officers rushed in, weapons drawn. Marcus had Thornton face down on the kitchen floor and the crowbar kicked safely away. "Suspect is secured," Marcus called out, breathing hard. Breaking and entering attempted assault with a deadly weapon. As the officers cuffed Thornton and read him his rights, the former HOA president looked up at Marcus with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." Marcus knelt down beside him. "Actually, Richard, it is over. You're going to prison for a very long time. Breaking into a police officer's home, attempting to assault his pregnant wife, that's not going to go well for you." Thornton's face crumpled as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his rage. "I had everything. I was somebody. I was respected." "You were feared," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the Willowbrook Estates Community Center once again. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The room buzzed with positive energy as residents discussed upcoming neighborhood improvements, a community garden, a playground renovation, a block party for the 4th of July. Mrs. Patterson had been elected as the new HOA president with a mandate to transform the organization from Thornton's authoritarian regime into something that actually served the community. The oppressive rules had been rewritten, the excessive fines abolished, and the neighborhood had become what it was always meant to be, a place where families could live in peace. Richard Thornton was serving a 3-year sentence for home invasion, assault, and stalking. His lawyer had tried to argue temporary insanity, but the evidence of his systematic harassment of multiple neighbors had painted a clear picture of deliberate, calculated behavior. Sarah had given birth to their daughter 2 months ago, a healthy, beautiful baby girl they named Hope. As Marcus watched his wife chatting with the other mothers in the neighborhood, he reflected on how much had changed. The community had learned that standing up to bullies was possible when they stood together. The other victims had found their voices and their courage. And Marcus had learned something important about the nature of real authority. It wasn't about fear or control, but about service and protection. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. "Thank you again for everything. My kids are playing outside without fear for the first time in years." Marcus smiled and put his phone away. Justice, he thought, sometimes came in unexpected ways, but it always came to those who stood up for what was right, who protected the vulnerable, and who refused to let bullies win. Richard Thornton had thought his position made him untouchable. He learned the hard way that real power came not from intimidating others, but from serving something greater than yourself. The neighborhood was finally at peace, and Marcus Rivera, detective and protector, had helped make that possible, not just as a cop, but as a neighbor, a husband, and a father who understood that home was worth fighting for. The end.